So I'm here with Sandra Coney, and before we start, Sandra, I want to just make sure that if you could confirm with a verbal yes that you're okay to be interviewed, you agree to be interviewed this afternoon?
Yes, I agree to be interviewed this afternoon for the project.
Okay, thanks. So the first group of questions is the background about your life, and I guess, you know, sort of where you are today, how you got to that place and what that journey was like for you. So things like what your central commitments were, what your career looks like, and any significant lifetime achievements for you professionally. And I'll remind you if we don't touch on those things.
So you want me to sort of go into that a little bit? Yeah,
your career arc, if you like.
I don't really consider that I've had a career because I'm one of those women of my era that is quite well educated, but I got married at 17. And so there was sort of no question of a career. And along the way, I went back to university with children and got involved in starting the first university creche in Auckland. And through that encountered feminism. And so really I got very involved in feminist activities. So I never had what you'd call a career. I've written books, I've been a journalist. There's lots of different ways that I've earned a living, but there's no kind of single thread that you could look at in my life. I mean, one of my things is I'm interested in a lot of things. I've never kind of narrowed myself down to any one thing. I'm like, if there hadn't been feminism along the way, I would have liked to been an archivist or a historian. And I actually, before I got married, applied for a job at the Auckland University Library, and probably that course would have been the one I'd taken. So I've written a lot of books on local history and women's history as well. And I really, really enjoy doing that and wish I had more time to do it. But I went into local body politics in 2002, stood for the Auckland Regional Council because I'm also very interested in environmental issues. So, and I've been, I was on the District Health Board for about 9 years. So, you know, there's been a lot of threads to my life, and I haven't kind of stuck to one, so to speak. Right.
You're accomplished at many things, it seems. So tell me a little bit about what you do now, what your role in the community is.
Right. So I am on the Waitākere Ranges Local Board, and there are 21 local boards in the Auckland Council, and then there's a governing body, which I was on. I stood for that when the Auckland Council was formed in 2010. I had one term there and didn't like it, wanted to be more involved in my local community. So so that role is answering questions and complaints from people on every imaginable subject. But my real passion is around historic heritage and the natural environment. So I've both got my, projects I'm involved in on the ground and those things, but also kind of trying to make sure that those are a priority in my local area and that things get funded, which is a bit of a mission at the moment. But so yeah, we don't have responsibility for everything in the local area. Some of those things are dealt with at a regional level, but we do have a responsibility for a lot. So I would have relationships with community houses, with arts groups, the environmental groups. So I spend a lot of time on that. Until last year, I was also on the District Health Board, which was the biggest district health board in New Zealand, Waitematā, and that also took up quite a lot of time, and I try to write around it. So I've got major sort of writing projects that I've been working on for quite some years, and I do that when I'm not doing those other things.
You are busy. So tell me, how has, and people in other countries may or may not have been following this, but recently Auckland was the brunt of a huge weather event. How has that impacted the work that you do on the local board?
We have very, very high rainfall in the area that I represent, because it's a forested Indigenous forest in very hilly, and the rainfall is something like 40% more than the rest of Auckland. And so there have been flooding episodes in the past. I've been involved in getting what we call resilience plans for the local communities, so that they know what to do when there is an emergency. You know, I'm pretty on the ground with those things. One of the things I'm trying to do at the moment is get a generator for the Piha Surf Life Saving Club, so it can be a welfare centre in these kind of instances. Yeah, that's it's certainly the welfare and the well-being of our local communities and some of them are quite isolated, and is very important, and something that I particularly on my board am involved in the West Coast, where you've got these small communities surrounded by a 17,000 hectare park, and who have to do everything for themselves, like volunteer fire service, volunteer first response, volunteer surf clubs, etc. So you know, you can't just get on the phone and a whole lot of urban resources will come your way. So people have to be very self-reliant.
Yeah.
But I enjoy that.
Oh yeah, that's good. You're enabling local communities, which is really helpful. So I've done a little background work on you. What's your connection or the history of connection with Piha?
My father and my mother bought a property there in the 1930s. My father was, both my mother and father were very good sports people, and my father was one of the very early members of the Piha Surf Life Saving Club. So I wrote, for instance, the history of the Piha Surf Life Saving Club for them as a volunteer thing. And my parents bought that property. It's still in the family. It's 25 acres. It takes a lot of looking after. And yeah, I still probably spend about half my time out there.
Nice.
But a bit primitive as you get older. So, you know, we have to have our own roof water, you know, our own sewage system. And the worst thing is that when you want to go to the toilet in the middle of the night, which you get to do a bit more as you get older, you have to go outside and go downstairs. So that's becoming increasingly unappealing as I get older, especially in the winter.
Oh yeah, I understand. I do a bit of tramping, so I'm on board with that. It gets more and more difficult. So tell me, is there one significant, or are there more than one significant sort of achievement in your lifetime that you want to highlight?
It's probably not what you would expect asking me as a feminist, but I chaired the Parks and Heritage Committee on the Auckland Regional Council, and with the support of my colleagues, I managed to get a number of new parks and amounting to 1,700 hectares of land that is now parkland for people in the Auckland region. So that's probably the most enduring sort of thing. And then I guess the other thing would be, you know, the Cartwright Inquiry, although it's sort of difficult now watching some of that being eroded, you know, at the present time. And some of us have tried to organise to kind of address that, but it's quite hard work, especially when the health system's in such a state of upheaval.
Yes, yeah. Yes, all the district boards are being, well, I guess amalgamated is not quite the word, but disbanded, and it's going central, correct? All the
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, and yeah, everything's being sort of centralised. And so they disbanded all the boards like the one I was on, where you had elected people. I could have put my name forward to be on the national body. I don't know that I would have got there anyway, but I found that sort of a bit of a formidable prospect, really. So I didn't put my name forward. I'm still working with groups of women on health issues, but I don't, I don't have any formal role at all.
Right. And so you've touched on that, and that was a big part. So I'll full confession, I wasn't actually in the country when that news story hit, but part of that was, would you like to sort of give us a potted summary of how the Cartwright inquiry came about?
Yeah, a colleague of mine who was at the medical school kind of told us a little bit about an experiment that had happened at National Women's Hospital. And my colleague, Phillida Bunkle, who was at that time at Victoria University Women's Studies, and I was involved in a group called Women's Health Action. Might have been called Fertility Action at the beginning. It was called Fertility Action. We put together, did a lot of investigation and put together a very large story that was published in a national magazine called Metro. And what it said very briefly was that women going into, which was the premier public hospital for women in New Zealand, with abnormal smears, abnormal cervical smears, were not given the standard treatment, but were watched just because the Professor Green, who was in charge of this research, believed that carcinoma in situ or cervical abnormalities were not the same disease as invasive cervical cancer, and that CIS did not progress into cervical cancer. So he watched women and brought them in very regularly to see what was happening, but they didn't always get the treatment they needed. And some of them progressed to cervical cancer, and a significant number of women died. So that, and it threw up looking at not just cervical cancer, and the particular doctors at National Women had instructed there being a cervical screening program in New Zealand for women, but also issues around ethics, the roles of ethics committees, and about how research was conducted, and issues like informed consent. So, and out of the inquiry, the sort of positive things were Helen Clark, the PM, announced a cervical screening program, which we still have, but not as in good shape now as it was. And there was a system of ethics committees set up in all throughout New Zealand. And one of the major things was the creation of the role of Health and Disability Commissioner, and a system which I think is once again a poor shadow of itself, of patient advocates in all public hospitals. So, and there's a code of patients' rights, which is in law, and I don't know whether New Zealand is the only country, it could be. Very few countries have informed consent enshrined in law. So we have that in New Zealand. So those were probably, and teaching was completely overhauled in our medical schools. And yeah, there were a lot of outcomes of it. I have to say though, because we went through the inquiry and we thought sort of that would be it. Judge Sylvia Cartwright came out with a report and recommendations, which we, were great. But years of my life, and Phillida's and others, went into keeping things on track after that, because after a period of time, the medical profession regrouped through their kind of professional bodies, and you just had to keep on the case to make sure that the things ended up how the judge had said they should be. Right. So that wasn't just something over in a couple of years for me. I spent many years after that. And I was still in a group called the Cartwright Collective of women who were involved in the inquiry, who still try and keep an eye on things and jump up and down when we need to.
Well, yes, vigilance is key, I guess, but I only just recently read the article that you and Phillida Bunkle put together, and it's riveting reading. Yeah. So thank you for that. Yeah, I know you think your environment stuff has been powerful, and not to take away from that, but for me personally, that article was really powerful. Yeah.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
do wonder now, I have said since, I don't think in the way the media is in this day and age, that we would be able to get an article like that published.
Right. You name names, and you're quite direct with even though it's not actually, you're very journalistic and very balanced. It's pretty obvious what's going on and who's really to blame. So yeah, that was fantastic. Thanks. Okay, I guess we should move on to the second set of questions now, and that's the background about your work. So you've got many strings. Maybe you should choose one string. So what drew you to the work that's most important to you? So what drew you to that in the beginning, and then how has that work changed over time? And how has it changed your life? And how has the life that you've lived changed the work that you've done over time?
Right, that sounds quite difficult, but so probably best to talk about feminism. So I grew up with a very, very powerful father who dominated my mother, and he was a great sportsman, and I had a very good childhood, and where my sister and I we're only two girls, were expected to do everything. So swimming in big surf, playing sport. So that was my background, but also seeing my mother. The first thing my father did when he married my mother was sell her hockey boots, and she was a very good hockey player. So he was a very powerful man. So over the years anyway, I always think nobody can intimidate me, because fighting with my father through my childhood and teenage years was a good training. So I went to an all-girls school, and I had a year at university doing Latin and English, and then I got pregnant, I got married, and in those days you gave everything up. Then you stopped everything, although I did go back to university with the support of my husband, who was very enlightened, ex-husband I should say, and there were two children. So when I went back to university with a child, I discovered that this was frowned on, and we got told, we all got told that we had to choose between higher education and motherhood. And so I actually banded together with a group of wonderful women, including one who was Professor Bonham from National Women's Wife, Nancy Bonham. It was a student and staff nursery society we formed, and we set about forming a creche for students and staff with children. And I think it was probably that I was flabbergasted, because I'd been brought up with a sort of girls could do anything childhood, and going to a girls' school, although now I know they were sort of steering us towards nursing and lab assistants and things, and the science teaching wasn't flash. I was pretty taken aback that anybody would try and sort of put obstacles in our way of continuing at university. So that was probably the kind of radicalizing experience for me. That was in the mid-60s. And the group of women, I mean, some of them are still friends that I worked with then. Miriam Safira, I met her through that creche group, and she's still a very close friend of mine. So, we were really pushing the boundaries, and, just realizing what we were up against. So now where do we go from there? After I didn't get involved in feminism, although I'd read a few books, like The Second Sex, Simone de Beauvoir, and I think a few others. But actually I thought I had quite a good life. I had a husband, he had a good job, I had 2 children, and I met Sharon Cederman, who tried to get me, who was very involved with, I think it was Auckland Women's Liberation, and wanted me to get involved. And I famously said to her, I don't need to do that. I've got a very nice husband. So there you are. So, and he was a very liberal sort of man, and he didn't, like a lot of men wouldn't have liked their wife going to university and putting their kid in a daycare. But then I thought I would go along, being curious. And in those days, I went into consciousness raising. So we did a fairly formal sort of consciousness raising group. And you see, then I came across all sorts of other things I really didn't know about, like girls who had brothers and their experience. So I kind of got a broader knowledge of women's lives. And also, so through that, I got involved in the Auckland Women's Liberation Group, and then a very well organised group. We had men there at the beginning, but after about a year, I think we went just women only. But I've still got some of my notes from that time, and we had all these different groups doing something, the Equal Pay and Opportunity Group, and, we had telephone trees, and we were highly organised. And one of the people in the group, Kitty Wishart, was the manager of the Auckland University Bookshop. So she used to bring along magazines and books that she was getting in through the bookshop. And that was also opening your eyes to see the magazines from Australia, UK, and America. And like, I actually think that, and I don't know whether these books are written because I don't kind of bury my head in academic stuff, but the way that the women's movement put together its policies and thinking and analysis was a sort of like a gigantic intellectual exercise, which doesn't sort of get credited. It's sort of seen as activism or something like that, but the whole unraveling how we saw the world and building a new picture for us. And then we said in this group, well, there's a whole lot of us with sort of skills in English language. Why don't we start the magazine? And that was when I got involved with Broadstreet magazine in 1972.
Right. Very cool. So was your goal with writing the magazine, was it to actually then sort of translate what was happening as far as the academic side of things, to actually make it more accessible? Or
I think we were more interested in reaching out to women and as a sort of vehicle for putting these new beliefs and ideas in front of women.
Right.
I mean, but having said that, I don't know what we mean by academic quite, because yes, some of the formal works, like during that time, I think it was Patricia Sinclair wrote the history of the suffrage movement in New Zealand, and my copy of that, which I've still got, is kind of, actually I pinched it off someone else. It's got someone else's name written inside it, but it was well thumbed. And my copy of William Sachs's Women with a Cause, in which he talked about some of this in Union Women, mine's falling, it's just in pieces. So there were people who were writing works that we fell on and absorbed, and they went into building our kind of case and our activism through the magazine. I also just want to mention here too, because I'd forgotten, that I also believe that you should, I didn't like getting too far away from the real life experiences of that New Zealand women were having at the time. So I worked from the first day at the Auckland Medical Aid Centre, which was the first abortion clinic in New Zealand. I was a councillor and I worked there for 10 years. So I felt that really kept my feet on the ground. Like, you can, in the women's movement at the time, you could start living a life that was just so far removed from other women. We were all living in places like, inner city suburbs like Ponsonby, Grey Lynn. A lot of women were living in, my marriage broke up in 73, and I went and lived with my sister. So there were women living in groups right through that area. And that was where you partied, that was where you went to meetings. And it could take you quite a long way away from the women living in the suburbs like I had lived in Papakura.
Right, yeah.
So, so because I had that experience of being a woman in the suburbs, and I've been on the school committee and all those kind of things, it was good to keep in contact with the struggles that women had. So that's why I kept, well, it's not the only reason. I believed in women's right to choose an abortion, but I was a councillor there, as I say, for 10 years.
Gosh.
And that was very political. As you know, at the time, there were several law changes after that, both to try and close the clinic down, but ultimately to make abortion more accessible to women. So I was doing them both.
Gosh, I can't imagine what that work must have been like, because I imagine it was fraught emotionally if you were the councillor there with women who possibly had to hide a lot. It had to be underground, basically.
Yes, but women kept it private on the whole. But, we had girls pregnant to their fathers. We had everything imaginable. I once had a girl pregnant to her father and the wife pregnant to the man. So yeah, it was, people accept abortion now, but it wasn't, a lot of people didn't welcome it. We had lots of protests outside. So you get these traumatized women coming in, having had to go past crosses and chanting. And we had an arson where the building was set fire to. People have, young women now, I have to stop myself saying that because but there's not a lot of knowledge about young feminists now of just what it was like at that time. And
it's hard to imagine. It's very hard to imagine, that it was that dangerous. And in some
places, it wasn't just the abortion. It was also like when I broke up with my husband, there was no benefits. I didn't have equality in our possessions. That there was no kind of matrimonial property act. So it was quite hard.
Right.
And that's probably being in the women's movement. You were with, because I had friends who didn't want me to come to their house anymore because they thought I'd run off with their husband, that sort of thing. That you actually developed a whole new social milieu and friendship networks of women who thought like you. So I wouldn't have missed it for the world,
Right.
But
it was, sorry to interrupt, but it sounds as though the parallel development between your career and your personal life, they almost grew together.
Yes, that's true.
Yeah. Okay, hey, thank you for that. So perhaps we should move to a more sort of a reflective outlook, and maybe you can tell me how you understand the term feminism and what has it meant to your work.
Interesting, because at the beginning we always use women's liberation. Feminism was a later term that came along. I consider I'm a radical feminist. One of the things when I was editing Broadstreet was, there was a plethora of sorts of feminism. I'm not an equal rights feminist. I am, I'm a radical feminist and subscribe to that set of beliefs. So I think there's a lot about the world that needs radical change, quite apart from which would benefit women, but would benefit a lot of people too. I just abhor the way in the last, 20 and a bit years, we've gone down this neoliberal path. I subscribe to some very sort of basic beliefs, and they were probably there before I encountered feminism, and those are about people having a fair go. I believe in egalitarianism. I don't like the gap between the extremely wealthy and the, poor off people. So yes, there's a lot I'd change about the world, as well as the sort of feminist things that we went after and achieved, because, a lot of what's happening at the moment, we don't sort of hear that about women. It's how women are affected by the sort of low wage economy that we've got. We used to talk about that sort of thing, but I don't hear too much now, because we had groups like women in the trade union movement, and there was a working women's charter, and we were organised, and there was a voice. There's a very strong voice coming from women in these different areas that would have tackled a lot of these things. Whereas now, if there's something about women, it's that we've got terrible problems around violence against women. Nobody's questioned pornography much these days, but there's still a lot that needs to be done for women. But it's very hard in this kind of climate of individualism and the sort of economic model of global trade, etc. that we're following. It drives me up the wall.
So would you say that perhaps the face of feminism has, well, you would say, I guess, that it's changed, but perhaps from what you're saying, it seems like the trade unions aren't perhaps as vocal for equal pay for equal work and that kind of thing. Would that be correct?
Yes. Like there was a great uprising, and things like the teachers' unions, the nursing unions, well, they're still mainly women, really had a focus on improving the conditions for women, and those were also things like leave, maternity leave, childcare, all those kind of things that enable women to work. Whereas now it mostly seems to be left to individual women and families to sort of make their own arrangement with these things. And it's still, although, women can do anything, but when you actually look at a lot of things, you still see how male dominated our society is. And you often think the women who are sort of in particular positions are the sort of tokenistic kind of, there's still a huge way to go. But there's also a number of other beliefs that I got out of my feminism education. And one of them that I adhere to really strongly is that you measure your progress by the women at the bottom. So the women who are the cleaners and the caregivers, who aren't even getting a living wage, those are the women that we should be measuring how women have done, not by the fact that we've got a woman prime minister, or we've got women in senior law firms and things like that. And I think that for the women at the bottom, things are pretty grim.
Yeah. So you would have heard the term intersectionality, I guess.
Yes.
So what's your take on that? Because it would seem to me that perhaps the women at the bottom aren't always white.
No, well, I get maddened by the term intersectionality, quite honestly, because it is sort of some of the sort of current thing. It's like calling the feminism of the second wave white women's feminism, and it's completely ahistorical. The people who take this line actually have never bothered to go back and look what we were actually doing. And the unions that included the lowest working women were active around feminism and supported by the feminist movement. And there were campaigns about things like night work for women, women being able to work in the freezing works, shop assistants. These were all things that were on the agenda. So the idea that it was some sort of middle class airy-fairy thing is and that might, I mean, New Zealand was a kind of fairly separated in terms of relationships between, especially in towns, Pākehā people and Maori and Pacific Island people. But they actually did come together in the women's movement in New Zealand. I can't comment on other places except to say that we got a heap from America about, Angela Davis's books and bell hooks. And so it wasn't like we were ignorant of these things. I mean, Angela Davis was on the cover of Thursday magazine, which was a mainstream women's magazine in the 1970s, so there's a mythology that has developed about what we did and didn't do. I mean, I was very friendly with a number of key Maori women, and their thing was, yes, they were critical of what we were doing, but they didn't want to be amalgamated into the women's movement. They wanted their own movement, and so originally called the Black Women's Movement, that they were involved in Ngā Tamatoa, and there was sort of kind of like a supportive relationship around these things. And no, it wasn't perfect, and no, we didn't know everything. No, we didn't know what we know now, but it certainly wasn't blind to the issues for Maori women. When I was at Broadstreet, we published the Maori sovereignty articles over 3 issues of the magazine, and then we published it as a book. So, and that was a an alliance between Maori women and the feminist movement. There were some Maori women who got very involved in the feminist movement, but on the whole, they carved their own path. But there was support for it was somewhat controversial, because when we did, had a lot in Broadsheet about different Maori women and what their issues were, and etc. Some people got upset, but it wasn't really big.
Okay, yeah.
So intersectionality, it's kind of like, I mean, probably every generation has to invent its own. I mean, I think back now about the women who were in things like the Council for Equal Pay and Opportunity when I got involved, and we were quite superior to them because we thought they were sort of old fuddy-duddies from the 1950s who had, and we didn't really know what they'd done or how hard it was. So I suppose it's just something each generation does, but I would have hoped that younger women now got more up to speed with what the women's movement was doing in New Zealand through the 70s and 80s.
I think from interviews I've conducted that yeah, I think there's more knowledge now and more gratitude for what's gone before. So that would be my take on it, at least. So it's interesting you say so. I'll throw this back at you and tell me if I've characterized it correctly. It seems like for the Maori women that they were supported, but they chose to go in a slightly separate way. They chose to be their own entity. Would that be correct?
Yes, absolutely. And also you have to remember that they were very often working alongside their men, and their groups involved men. And the women's movement at that time was pretty separate. It's still, it's like I had male children, and it was not a happy, it was difficult having male children at the time. So working with men definitely, wouldn't have been welcomed. But, lots of feminists got involved in the Springbok tour in Bastion Point, in Waitangi, things. I mean, I got arrested there, went to prison. So you know, it wasn't that we were ignoring, but you weren't going to be a leader in, you know, Maori women's issues. You would support them.
Yes.
But it was their, you know, their issues that they should lead, which they did very well.
Yeah, no, I understand, and that makes perfect sense to me, and still today, I think that that's the case. Okay, so let's move on now to the fourth of the 6 topics, and this one is the relationship between feminist scholarship and activism. And you've touched on this a little bit, but how do you perceive the relationship between scholarship and activism in general and in your own work? And the final question in that lot that I'm going to ask you, and I guess I should start with that, is, do you identify as a feminist?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. I'm a radical feminist, and I say that to people when I need to. Yeah, it came out recently. Something was said at one meeting. Anyway, yes, I am. I'm not quite sure what you mean by the sort of relationship between academic and activism.
Right.
Because there's some funny things that's happened in universities around feminism that is sort of like it wasn't particularly useful for the women's movement.
Want to speak to that a little bit, because that would be your answer to that question.
Well, not particularly. I mean, we soaked up books and, you know, works that were being written by people all over the world,
right.
that were sort of quite academic, but they didn't necessarily, well, I mightn't have even noticed whether they came out of universities or we had relationships with the women that were running the women's studies courses in universities, which have also gone down a funny route since. So there was definitely a relationships between the university, and I'm fumbling around here. I'm not being very coherent, but certainly in terms of our ideas and our kind of belief systems were very influenced by work, you know, authoritative works that were put together in all those countries.
Yeah.
But they weren't necessarily like academic work. Like some of the best stuff that I used to grab was coming out of some of the overseas women's magazines, but you know, they were definitely sort of analytical.
Right. Yeah, and I guess that's what I mean. So you could think of it as like theory or more
Yes.
sort of like an academic focus, and then putting that into practice, I guess, or what the activism.
Yes, and it was certainly the forms of feminism. I mean, they were very much being fluid and sort of worked on through all the time that I was very involved in a sort of organized women's movement. Because, I mean, we had things like in the 70s, you know, the whole develop of that cultural feminism and spiritual feminism, which I personally have got no time for. But, you know, that was what people were doing. And then you would have debates, and we had a number of sort of big women's caucuses, not just the United Women's Conventions, but there were kind of retreats, and where quite big groups of women would go away and people would present things and do papers, and we would argue and hiss at each other sometimes. But so yeah, I mean, the whole kind of policy and framework of feminism was sort of a work in progress the whole time I was involved in the feminist movement. And I really valued that about it. That's one of the things I don't like about today, is that, you know, everything's too black and white for me. The subtleties are much more interesting. And and I think the women's movement did do that. It got very heated at times, but I think the women's movement did do that. It didn't have,
Right. Well, it seems to me too that in having read the Metro magazine piece that you wrote with Phillida Bunkle, that you're certainly, you know, your knowledge of feminism and the theory and whatever else you've read came out in that, and it, you know, must have reached quite a few women who would not normally have even thought about, like, well, why are these issues? You know, I wouldn't have known about this if this hadn't been brought to my attention. So to me, that's a form of activism. So I'm guessing that would be the connection, one connection.
Yes, definitely.
Okay. So let's also you identify. Okay. So this next section and the two final sections are really talking about where you see what's happening with the work that you do in talking about feminism in New Zealand, and its links to international. So the first question is, what is your analysis, evaluation, and expectation of the development of feminism in New Zealand? That's a big one.
Yes, you'll have to say it again. You
Yes.
mean going forward?
Yeah, I guess. Like, and now what's maybe let's start. Well, no, let's do it all. Analysis, evaluation, and expectation of the development of feminism in New Zealand.
Right. Well, I'm not sure what the feminist movement is in New Zealand anymore. I mean, there are particular, you know, things like the Me Too that's come here that, but it's quite fragmented. There doesn't seem to be a sort of coherent worldview that I'm aware of, or any groups that are espousing it. We were pretty well organised, but now there's groups that have got a particular interest, but there's lots of gaps. You know, could we do a United Women's Convention and bring everybody together? I think also the getting back to the fact that there's very little subtlety in the feminist voice these days. It's kind of, and the whole thing with cancel culture and that sort of thing really gets in the way of being sort of more nuanced about what's going on. And I find that really sad, you know. And I think some of the older feminists that I've talked to feel that way too, that, and I have to be careful what I'm saying here, but, you know, there's a lot of different strands to life, and some of them, as far as women are concerned, are not getting much attention. And the violence against women, which, you know, we all know and acknowledge is a terrible problem in New Zealand, there doesn't seem to be any kind of coherent program for how that's going to be addressed. You will hear about, you know, there's refuge, that's all still there, and that was all started in the 70s. But, you know, what's our critique of masculinity in New Zealand and why we have this problem? And I would start to talk about kind of our attitude towards sport, male sport, etc. But we're just hearing, I think there needs to be a broader, more cohesive platform going forward than what we've got. And I don't know how that would come about. I don't see that us older feminists could do it. And yeah, I don't know what they do in universities these days, whether there are groups of feminists in universities, but yeah, it's interesting how we all, like moths to a light bulb in my era, kind of got
Right.
attracted and brought together. What would be the thing that brought together? And maybe the other thing is the social media actually gets in the way of that, because it kind of, it's enough to put up your post and, you know, sound off on social media, but that's sort of here today and gone today. So
Right.
I don't know what the mechanism would be for organising.
It's
And
interesting.
probably younger people might say, well, you don't have to, you know, but I don't. And it's the same with some of the other issues too, you know, that I'm interested in. Like, I'm interested in climate change, and
Yeah.
you know, there doesn't seem to be any kind of formidable response to these things that we should be responding to.
Right. Yeah.
And so then this is a little bugbear of mine.
Mhm.
So in the absence of any kind of organised something, the people who get to speak for women now are some of the women MPs who have no mandate, in my view. They belong to a political party. They don't come out of a feminist movement, but they often be taken as the ones that are the kind of oracles when it comes to women's issues.
Mhm.
Because there is no other obvious sort of voice except around some particular issues.
Right. Yeah, I was thinking that as you were talking, actually, it's sort of the difference between the public and the private. So those that speak the loudest get heard. So it's those public figures, but they're not necessarily the people who should be speaking.
No, they're self-appointed.
Yeah.
Like there was in the women's movement, for all its difficulties, that you know, you were part of a broad-based movement with women right through New Zealand and groups right through New Zealand. And so, you know, if somebody kind of stepped up and spoke out of turn, they'd very quickly hear about it. Whereas now there's no checks and balances like that. You know, anybody could just appoint themselves as the spokesperson on women and get up and do it. And the women's ministry sort of seems to have gone into a hole. So we just, and the older groups, it's quite interesting that what we get these waves of feminism, and in between the older women's groups are the things that hold the flame. And I became very aware of that when I wrote the history of the Auckland YWCA, and they started in the 19th century. And if you look, whenever there was a sort of lull in feminist activity, it would be those organisations that spoke up for women. And I'm not hearing that either. So I'm still in touch with YWCA, and they do a lot of leadership things with young women and that sort of thing. But the kind of voice of women is likely to come from a media star or a politician or something like that, rather than somebody embedded in a movement.
Right. Yeah, and that's where social media comes in, I guess. You know, it's very easy to be a media star on social media, in social movements. Yeah. Okay, so you've talked a little bit about the relationships with other women's organisations in the country and other activists. What about international connections, kinds of that sort of thing? Do you have connections with other, either however you'd classify your work as activist or scholarship or organising in other countries? Do you have any specific connections with people?
I belong to, despite everything I've just said, a number of online groups who are international. Australia, mainly Australia and the UK, I think. Because you don't always know, like you're talking away to people online. And I belong to a group called FOUL, Feminist Older, God, I won't get it right, Feminist Older Women. I often say lesbians, but I don't think the L stands for lesbians anyway.
Right.
Which I would probably get about half a dozen, emails from them every day.
Right.
And the people in America too. yeah, you don't always know whether they could actually be living in the next suburb to you, or they could be in Canada, couldn't they? So I'm involved in those groups. I'm involved in the Cartwright Collective, but that's just New Zealand. Yeah, I mean, I'm not doing huge amounts for feminism these days. The main area is continuing to follow up on the Cartwright health issues. I mean, I sort of, when your time is going, I'm 78, I kind of trying to spend time doing things that I really want to do.
Yes.
So, and I almost shy away from some of the more controversial topics because I just sort of think I don't need it in my life. I don't need to get wound up and aggravated about things that, or sometimes it just looks like enormous effort would have to be put in. And I think, oh, I haven't got that. There's other things that are more important at the moment.
Yeah. Yeah, I understand that. So you talked a little bit about this particular book. Do you sense any differences or similarities in any of the issues that these groups or your connections with people internationally, any differences or similarities in issues that come up?
Similarities between?
In like you focus perhaps on in foul, for example. Are there from between like what happens in New Zealand and then what happens overseas?
No, I think there's sort of concerns are pretty consistent with people from different countries. Well, they're all Western countries, aren't they? So there would probably be other issues if I was tapped into some of those other countries, which when I was doing Broadstreet, we had those kind of connections to feminists in different in other countries, but I don't now really, apart from the online things.
Right. So is there a difference in the way that people approach the issues? If the issues are the same, are they sort of like broached in different ways?
Not really.
Similarly, okay. Yeah. Okay. So, okay. I think that we've actually come to the end of my set of questions. Do you have any other final sort of comments before I switch off the recording mode? And I'd like you to stay around a little bit after I've switched off recording.
Okay. Yeah. I'd probably like to just comment on the whole trans issue, which is, you know, I think absorbing a lot of feminist energy and has become a sort of a real focus. And I worry that it's a bit of a diversion. I mean, it's kind of like that is where a lot of feminist attention is going, but these other issues are also still needing to be solved. And you know, I understand about the trans issue, but I don't know. But you know, the violence against women, which is a sort of global phenomenon, really, really pains me that women are still subject to sexual violence and physical violence. And we just, you know, it just, and there are lots of ways in which it's kind of being made worse. Through, you know, social media, people get access to all sorts of material that in the days gone by they wouldn't have. You know, in my day, it was a scrappy little magazine you had, you know, and boys kept under their pillows, but now it's just kind of everywhere. And it's been kind of normalized in lots of ways. Yeah, so I do worry about that we you know, we're just not making the progress on some issues. And another one is also where there's been enormous slippage and nobody talks about it, is the stereotyping of girls. You know, like we fought for girls to be able to be do whatever they like, to play whatever games they like, to wear the clothes they like, to have their hair chopped off or whatever it was. And we put enormous amounts of energy too into children's literature and making sure that there were books that presented strong female role models for girls. And it just sort of feels like that is another area where there's been huge slippage, where, I mean, I just about throw up when I go into children's toy shops and shops. I can remember, I'll tell you a funny story. I went to Smith & Co.'s and I was looking for something for a baby that was coming in my family, and I picked up one that was mauve. And the shop assistant said, "Oh, that's usually for girls." And I said, "Oh, well, in my day it was for lesbians." But all that stuff's got really, really terrible. You know, you don't ever see a girl with short hair. When I watch the New Zealand rugby women playing, they've all got great big long heads of annoying hair.
To be fair, actually, many of the men do too.
That's true. Why would you want to if you could have it all? Anyway, I just were really worried about that stereotyping. At the same time, they seem to be off, you know, like girls can do anything. So maybe it doesn't matter. But it is sort of like a very conformist sort of presentation of their individuality. So I do think there's a heck of a lot. There's been slippage and there's lots of unfinished business.
Right.
And you know, a lot of attention's going into a very narrow range of issues.